Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to another episode of the Eon Podcast. We're joined today by Dr. Zaher Sahloul, who is from Homs, and he is a pulmonary and critical care expert based out of Chicago, but he's a true born and bred Syrian, studied from Damascus University. He is the founder and president of MediGlobal. MediGlobal is a beyond borders kind of medical charity or organization which has helped 30 million people across war zones and third world countries in the last 7 years, including Pakistan. So he's already been, so he knows what we're like. So be nice in the comments. Dr. Zahir, how are you doing, sir? Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Alhamdulillah, I'm doing very well. Things are moving very quickly in my homeland, and I've been fixated on social media, talking to my family over the past few days, trying to figure out what will happen and what's happening. But Alhamdulillah, I'm blessed.
We spoke to Razan, who's another Syrian activist based out of the UK, and we were speaking before as well. You said that there are mixed feelings with regards to what is happening, and we'll get to your role as a medical expert and humanitarian afterwards. But as a Syrian, as a father, as the son of parents who have been through what they've been through, how do you feel about what's going on in Syria right now?
I mean, as your audience probably know, Syria has been going through a huge crisis over the past 13 years, since 2011. At the peak of the Arab Spring in Syria, demonstrations started, and then the Assad regime responded with extreme brutality. The peaceful demonstrations were transformed into a rebellion, and Assad used all kind of weapons against the people. And then there were division of Syria. There were armed groups. There were creation of ISIS. Chemical weapons were used by the regime against people more than 300 times. We published report about that. Hospitals were attacked. There was a huge refugee crisis. Half of the population of Syria has a population of 24 million before the war. Half of them have been displaced inside, and about 7.5 million became refugees in Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, Iraq, and Egypt, and Europe. More than 1 million people became refugees in Europe. And still, 1 out of 4 refugees in the world is from Syria right now. And of course, half of Syria have been destroyed. Syria has been divided to 4 different parts. Each one of them have their own administration and government and militias. So things have been very rocky over the past 14 years. So every Syrian have a lot of horror stories and terrible conditions with their families. I had several members of my families who were killed. My wife's cousin was killed by a sniper. She was 40 years old, and has 3 young babies in 2013. I have several members of my families who became refugees in Lebanon, in Egypt, in Australia, in Germany, and other places. And right now we are seeing acceleration of events in Syria with the what we call the liberation of Syria from the Assad regime that has been controlling Syria for the past 60 years. I'm talking about Bashar al-Assad, and then before that, his father, Hafiz al-Assad. The only president I got to know, or the family of presidents, is Hafiz al-Assad and then Bashar al-Assad, his son. So this liberation started in Aleppo, then southern Idlib, then Hama, the city of Hama, and now it's very close to my city. So a lot of hope, happiness, anxiety, fear of what will happen, fear on my family. I have parents. My parents are in Homs, and my sister, and I've been talking to them, and they are very scared. So mixed emotions.
No, I think justifiably you have mixed emotions about this. It's more often than not that the geopolitical strategic point of view is discussed when discussing conflicts, and the human cost of this kind of warfare is ignored. As a medical doctor and as head of Medic Global, what was your experience like in Syria and the work that you've done prior to this particular restart of the conflict? And what is the human cost of this kind of warfare?
I think Syria is. is a book of what can be the worst that can happen in a war or in a crisis. So we have seen and witnessed everything. We have seen slaughtering of people. More than 600,000 people have been killed in Syria. Syria is a small country, relatively. 24 million people. Half of the population have been displaced. People were put under siege. We had children at one point dying because of malnutrition, similar to what we are seeing in Gaza, but we've seen it in 2014 and 15 in Madaya and in Zabadani and East Ghouta, under siege by the Assad regime and by Hezbollah at that time. We had chemical weapons used more than 300 times. I mean, I think it's the only country in the modern history that chemical weapons used by the regime against its people, many, many times, including sarin gas, which is a nerve gas, and choking agents, which is chlorine gas. We published report about the use of chemical weapons in Syria. We had to train Syrian doctors on the use of chemical weapons. This is not something that we learn in medical school. We had to provide them with antidotes and to teach them how to use decontamination and things like that. And so it's horrible situation. And out of these lessons, I mean, we had to work in hospitals that were built underground because the Assad regime targeted hospital, similar to what Israel has been doing in Gaza. I worked in hospitals that were bombed multiple times, and then we built it in underground in the basements of buildings. I visited hospitals that were built inside caves because communities wanted to provide healthcare to the people, and Assad regime targeted hospitals, so they built hospitals inside a cave. So it tells you that people are resilient and they want to survive and they want to live and they want to provide healthcare to their communities despite of the war and the missiles, and that speaks for the resiliency of the Syrian people. But it was a horrible situation over the past 14 years, and we did what we can do. I mean, I'm a physician in Chicago. I love my work. I still have full-time practice, but we organized ourselves initially under the banner of the Syrian American Medical Society. And there's a similar Pakistani American organization who comes, APNA, who come to Pakistan and provide healthcare. So we did medical missions. We supported doctors and hospitals inside Syria. We built hospitals. We provided salaries. We provided training. We sent technology. We sent medical supplies across the border from Jordan, from Turkey, from Lebanon. We provided healthcare to the refugees and displaced people, all kind of stuff that you can imagine. And then we started to do that to the rest of the world because we felt that there was outpouring of sympathy. There were many physicians, including Pakistani American physicians, who joined us into medical missions to provide healthcare to the Syrian refugees in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Turkey. And we thought that we need to give back. And that was the idea of establishing MediGlobal. So in the last 7 years, we worked in 26 countries, impacted 30 million peoples, as you've mentioned. And right now we have teams on the ground in 10 countries. And so it's a crisis that affected not only Syrians, the Syrian crisis, but affected the neighboring countries. As I've mentioned, 7.5 million Syrians were refugees, became refugees. Turkey took 3.5 million of them, Lebanon 1.5 million, Jordan 1 million, Egypt to 250,000, the same thing in Iraq. Germany took 1 million Syrian refugees. And this refugee crisis created anti-refugee sentiment in the West, the rise of populism. Brexit, I think, was indirect outcome of the Syrian crisis. ISIS was created in Syria because of the chaos. We believe that it was orchestrated by the Assad regime to show the West that, either me or ISIS. Anyway, that created this extremist ideas and ideologies at one point, and it controlled 40% of the Syrian land. And now it's history, but these things stay around, and its impact affect the population for a long, long time. Every Syrian is traumatized, including myself and my family, and I think the scars of the war over the past 14 years will stay with us for the rest of our lives.
No, Allah bless you and the work that you guys are doing. But beyond just the physical ailments that come with warfare, malnutrition, injuries, lacerations, sexual assault, and rape victims, even chemical weapons, like you mentioned. What about the mental health situation? Does MediGlobal do anything to do with counseling and helping the doctors to be able to deal with their patients? And how do you recover from that? Like you guys are working on ground in Gaza as well. What's the kind of training that you give to the medical staff as well as to the patients that are coming in how to cope with constant warfare? Like I'll give you an example. In Gaza, there's a if you watch anything from Gaza, there's a constant drone of Israeli, there's a sound of Israeli drones constantly buzzing in the background. How do people get over that kind of psychological trauma, or is that permanent and maybe it's something harder to resolve?
Yeah. I mean, I was in Gaza in January of this year for 2 weeks. I stayed in Rafah. We have local 19 clinics and stabilization centers for the treatment of malnutrition. Our local clinics are run by Palestinian doctors and nurses, but also we send medical missions from the US. Right now, we have our seventh medical missions in the last year. We have three physicians. I think one of them is Pakistani American, if I'm not mistaken. And I was there for 2 weeks, and the war was unfolding in front of my eyes because the war was in Khan Yunis. We were in Rafah, but we worked also in Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis. So every day we were commuting to Khan Yunis. You open the window in the ICU and you see the bombs, the smoke, you feel the shaking, the building shaking because of the missiles. And the drone is 24/7. You see two or three drones every day, and the buzzing sound of the drone stays in your ear. And then you see the impact of the missiles on as a mass casualty coming to the hospital. And I was in one of these mass casualty events. There were 30 plus people who came in, carried on the back or on the ambulances by their family members. Half of them are children. Seven of them were dead on arrival. And then we had to resuscitate the children on the floor of the emergency room. One of the children I remember very vividly because he had injury on his brain and injury on his belly. We took him to the operating room, and he did not survive. He was on life support, and next day he was brain dead. His name is Ahmed Abu Shahla. He was 12 years old. I took a copy of his death certificate because I wanted to show the media in the United States and policymakers that children are being killed in Gaza. So all of these impact, of course, not only the population, every Palestinian is traumatized, but also us and also the medical doctors and the nurses who are treating them. I mean, I had the luxury of leaving Gaza, but now you have physicians and nurses who've been there and they're stuck there and they have to provide care despite of the challenges. The same thing in Syria, of course, we had the same thing. So we talk a lot of time about mental health impact of wars and disasters on the population. And of course, I would think every person in Syria, every person in Gaza is traumatized. What trauma, mental health trauma means anxiety, phobias, depression, PTSD. Children are affected. The women and the elderly and the disabled and the injured are affected more than others. So more vulnerable population are affected more than strong young people. But even strong young people will be affected. Mental health is not something that we speak about in Syria, similar probably to Pakistan. We kind of keep it inside, and then it manifestates itself as pains, as headache, as neck pain, as back pain, or stomach pain. So people don't come to you and they tell you, I'm depressed, or I have anxiety, or I have nightmares. You have to figure it out. So it's important that we train physicians and nurses on how to detect mental health trauma and incorporate it in the management of every patient who comes to you for different reasons. And that's what we do in Gaza. That's what we do in Syria. So we train primary care physicians on detecting mental health trauma and providing treatment to these patients and referring the more difficult cases to psychiatrists. And also we do community-based mental health support. So there's multiple levels of providing mental health support, from what we call it mental health first aid, when you have a bomb coming and then you have people coming. So the first few hours, it's important that you make sure that the children and the women and the elderly feel that they are safe and they are protected, and there is support for them. So this first few hours of first aid of mental health is important, but then you have also other layers of providing mental health.
Right. I think it's a often ignored subject, but I think now, with the advent of the internet and the way people are seeing directly the conflict and the sort of atrocities that their fellow brethren are facing in Palestine or in Syria, they're able to now have the conversation about the mental health of these people and the trauma that they're facing. One of and speaking of trauma and friction that doctors might face in a war zone, what about the political pressure in Israel, in Gaza, under the occupation? How is that compared to Syria? Do you have problems with the management, with the regime? Do they cause trouble for you in Syria, in Gaza? Or is it once you're in, they're sort of you are on your own, you are part of the people, or they treat you separately?
So, I mean, that's interesting question. And then people think that Israel is, well, Israel, of course, is the enemy. It's well-known enemy. It's an occupier. So, and they're doing horrible things in Gaza. They attacked many hospitals. According to the WHO, more than 1,200 attacks on hospitals were documented. More than 550 medics were killed in Gaza over the past year or so, including two of our team members. One of them, a doctor in the ICU in Kamal Udwan Hospital, who was just killed a couple of weeks ago. He was in his way from his home to Kamal Udwan Hospital when a missile targeted him, and he was killed. He was the head of the intensive care unit, Dr. Muhammad Al Kalhout. We lost also another staff member a few months ago when he went to check on his home, and his home was bombed. And we had six team members who are detained from Kamal Adwan Hospital. So these things are, of course, terrible war crimes. Every attack on healthcare is a war crime. We are very vocal about that. We call for protection of doctors and nurses and humanitarians. We believe in medical neutrality. That means doctors and nurses and ambulances and hospitals should be protected even in the time of war. This is guaranteed by international humanitarian law and Geneva Convention for 150 years, but they are violated. These laws are violated in Gaza, and they were violated in Syria by the Assad regime multiple times. We published a report called Risking Life to Save Lives, the ordeal of Syrian doctors in 2012. And then we had to publish a follow-up report after a few years. We documented more than 650 attacks on hospitals in Syria by the Assad regime and Russia over the past 13 years that killed more than 950 doctors and nurses in Syria. And that's why we had to work in hospitals underground. I worked in hospitals in Aleppo that were built underground because they were bombed multiple times. And doctors worked in Syria in hospitals that were built inside a cave. I visited one of them in a village north of Hama called Kafar Zeta. And the doctor, who is a cardiologist, local cardiologist, Dr. Abdul Karim Al-Araj, he had a hospital in the village. It was bombed by the Assad regime, and then the villagers refused to let him rebuild another hospital in the village. So he had to relocate to a mountain and build a hospital inside a cave. I visited. It's called the Central Cave Hospital of Syria, and he told me that he wanted to make it a museum after the end of the war. Unfortunately, he was killed a few months after my visit in 2016 with the heat seeking missile when he was leaving the hospital. So these things are horrible, it's something that we don't talk about in the media. These attacks on hospitals. I think every doctor, every humanitarian should be vocal because this is something that is part and the core of why being a doctor. We We swear the oath, Hippocratic oath at the end of medical school, that we want to save lives, and that we believe in that we should be protected, and every physician should have the right to treat his patients or her patients, even in the time of the war, even if they happen to be the enemy of the other party. And this is violated. The WHO tracks these attacks on healthcare, and they're increasing year after year because there is no accountability, and the media don't pay attention to these issues, and that should change.
As a medical doctor who's with Med Global, you're obviously morally consistent in that you're providing healthcare to Gazans, you're providing healthcare to Syrians, Bangladeshis, Sudanese, Yemenites, wherever. How do you find the discourse around Syria, your home country, when it talks about when you see a moral inconsistency in the axis of resistance? Don't you feel like Russian bombs are anti-imperialist and that when they kill doctors, they kill them peacefully compared to American or Israeli bombs?
That's a great question. And I can tell you, Muhammad, that we're suffering Syrians from this access of resistance on, especially on social media, because every time we talk about the Assad regime bombing hospitals, and Iranians putting areas under siege, and the use of chemical weapons, then we have these trolls, and some of them, I call them useful idiots because they don't know what's going on in Syria. Some of them have this colonizing mindset that they believe that they know better than Syrians what's good for Syrians. Some of them are paid by Putin or Iran or the Assad regime to troll us and to threaten us. I had threats on my lives on the internet because I'm very active on these issues of advocacy. I believe that we should be vocal about it. And it's tough, but I believe that the victims and the oppressed people everywhere should be supported, whether you are Palestinians or Syrian or Yemeni or Ukrainian or Colombian. All of us are human beings, and every person should have access to healthcare in the time of war. And healthcare is a human right. So don't tell me that Palestinians are different than Syrians, or Pakistanis are different than Afghanis, or Ukrainians are less worthy of support or more worthy of support than the Yemenis. And I believe in moral consistency, as you have mentioned. And I think this is the essence of our faith, and also the essence of our humanity. If you just be selective in supporting people who happen to belong to your tribe or to your religion, then I think there is something wrong in your faith. The essence of humanitarian work is there's four principles: humanity first. That means you treat the people who are suffering everywhere based on the need. Medical neutrality. That means you should be protected when you provide that need. And impartiality. That means you have to work through sometimes difficult groups or entities or authorities, even if you don't like that, in order to get the medicine and the surgery to the person that in need. And independence, that means you are independent from the politics of the country that you came from. And we embrace those four principles to the core.
No, it's funny that you mentioned that to be a humanitarian, one's faith must be in the right place. It's not a tribal or political affiliation. It is to provide medical health care to anyone who is in a, is suffering, is in pain in a war zone or otherwise. And you mentioned that a lot of the anti-imperialist or the anti-colonial group has a colonial sort of mindset where you have non-Syrians, especially European commentators, explaining to Syrians why they need to support Bashar because there is great geostrategic value in using Syria as a refueling supply route for Hezbollah against Iran, via all of these different cities. And it's really funny because while they're anti-imperialistic, there's nothing more imperialistic than the Assad regime, which is a leftover of French colonialism. And propping them up is basically the Iranian militias, Hezbollah, and Russian air support. Without that, they've started to crumble. How do you respond to these kinds of threats, like the death threat you mentioned? What is the way forward for Syrian diaspora and the Syrian community at home?
In the beginning, I used to reason with people on the internet. Some of them you can reason with. I mean, I tell them, I support Palestinians. I've been in Palestine. I risked my lives in Gaza multiple times because to provide healthcare to the Palestinian victims of war. So people who are naive or who are neutral, they actually listen and they change their mindsets. But some people are very malignant, and not only on the left but also on the right, because for some reason Assad has support on the extreme right and the extreme left. The Nazis support Assad, and the very lefty support Assad because they think that he is part of the axis of resistance. And for some reason, the anti-imperialists they only blame the United States, which I blame my country for their stupid policies in the Middle East, and I think some skewed policies that created a lot of death and disasters in the Middle East, whether the Iraqi war or the support, the blind support of Israel. I think all of us agree that the United States policies are not good for the region, and they're oppressive. But also Russia's policies are not good for the region, and they are oppressive. And also their invasion of Ukraine is not right. Their support of the Assad regime that slaughtered more than 600,000 people of his people is not right. The policies of Iran is not right. They send their militias. In Syria, we have Irani militias called Zainabiyun and Fatimiyun. They brought from Afghanistan, from Iran, from Pakistan, from Iraq to fight the Syrian people in Syria. So to me, Iran and Russia are as imperialistic as the United States. But people who are not familiar with these geopolitics don't know these things. To us, Russia, Iran, the United States, Israel are the same. In Syria, I'm talking about as Syrian. They are interfering with our countries. They're creating problems. They are killing people. And they're not doing it for the welfare of the Syrian people because they have national interest. And so they use religion or they use the politics to support their national interest, not because they want to help Syrians, because they want to help the policy of their country.
Absolutely right. And you mentioned that the left and the right on the far extremes, that you'll find that they are the ones who tend to have a lot of criticisms about any anti-Assad sort of sentiment. Don't you think that there is an underlying agreement on the far left and the far right with regards to Islamophobia? That the driving factor is actually a deep hatred for Islam and the general Muslim consensus?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think there's an element of Islamophobia in these attacks. There's a guy called Aaron Mate. He's a liberal Jew who's very vocal
Aaron
in
Mate,
support.
I know him. Aaron Mate, I
Yeah,
know him.
yeah. And a couple of weeks ago, I tweeted about him. He received an award by an organization called CARE in the United States because of his support of the Palestinian issues. And I said, this is a guy that supported Assad, who mocked the victims of chemical weapons in Syria, who said that there's no Uyghur genocide, who said that there's no Bosnian genocide. And he should not be receiving an award. I mean, I believe in moral consistency. If you support the Palestinians, you have to support the Syrians and the Uyghur and the Ukrainians and so forth. And then he had a campaign of disinformation against me with his trolls and so forth, and it was horrible. But I think part of it is Islamophobic. They think that because I happen to be Muslim, that means I have extremist ideas or things like that, and this is terrible. And
No,
the
I mean,
same thing with
before this interview happened, you and I, we discussed our Takfiri Wahhabi agendas, and we said, we praised Osama bin Laden, and we had a nice conversation about jihad. And you know how we are, Sunnis. You know,
yeah, of course.
we pledged allegiance to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, and we had a full scheme of bringing him back. You with your medical science reviving him, and with the power of dua. This complete mischaracterization. Aslan, I think that there has been a very convenient convergence of the left and the far right in their hatred for Sunni mainstream generic Islam. Shia
Yeah.
Islam, in the backing of Iran, with all due respect, has positioned itself in a sort of as a far leftist revolutionary ideology, which it's not. It's also conservative religious ideology, but they've positioned themselves in a way. And in the mix, in the middle, I think that the memory of international jihadism with Al Qaeda and with Daesh that has left people with an excuse to, completely do away with 70% of the ummah, which is, more than a billion people, and describe them as takfiri Wahhabis and whatever. And anytime they have any demand for their political sovereignty, it's always, they want to make a caliphate and they want to make jihad and so on and so
Yeah.
forth. And
I mean, Islam is part of our heritage
yes,
in Syria, like the same way in Pakistan, part of our identity. We're quite diverse, actually, in Syria. We have Christians, we have, at one point, we had Jews. Most of them right now are in the United States or Israel. We had Yazidis, we have Alawite, we have Shia, mainstream Shia, we have Ismailis. So Syrians are very quite diverse. We have more than 37 different ethnic and religious groups. And I believe in diversity. And I believe that everyone should have equal right as a citizen. But Islam is part of the identity of Syria. I'm from the city of Homs. So when you mention Homs, you mentioned Khalid ibn
Khalid bin
al-Walid.
Walid,
Khalid ibn
radiallahu
al-Walid
anhu.
is buried in Homs. So every Homsi is proud of the fact that Khalid ibn Walid is buried in Homs. He chose Homs to live in and to die in there. And
SubhanAllah.
we're proud of this heritage. But I believe in moderate Islam. I think we in Syria suffered from the extremist ideologies that you mentioned, ISIS. We believe that ISIS was created by the Assad regime when he opened the prison to the people, jihadis whom he recruited to fight the Americans in Iraq, and then when the
The
Americans
IRGC even trained them. The Iranian Guard even trained a
yeah,
lot of
yeah,
the, yeah.
definitely. Yeah, I
And
mean, you know the
Qasim
history. Not many
Soleimani,
people know this
Qasim
history.
Soleimani is celebrated as a hero in a lot of Pakistan, by the way. But for the audience, I mean, as a Syrian, can you tell people what you think of Qasim Soleimani and what do people think in Syria about Qasim Soleimani?
He's a mass murderer. He killed children, Syrian children. He's responsible for slaughtering of many civilians in Syria. Many Syrians were joyous actually when he was
Yes,
assassinated. And but of course, there is part of the Syrians who are supportive of the Assad regime who believe otherwise, and he was celebrated as a martyr and so forth, and by the Assad regime and also by Hezbollah and by Iran. But to many Syrians, Qasim Soleimani is the devil himself because he's the one who organized the support of the Assad regime and oversaw the committing of many massacres and the siege of Ghouta and north of Homs and many areas and I think he we wish that he was held accountable in the court of law. Um, but yeah, I mean that's Qasim Soleimani.
right. And generally, the idea that the Syrian people, how do they feel, do you think, about the Palestinian cause? Because there is a propaganda online, and you mentioned people like Aaron Mate, who, I mean, I respect for their journalism on Palestine and their coverage of Palestine. But on Syria, all of these people, they've gotten awards, like you mentioned. They have brushed under the rug the plight of the Syrian people in a defense of Russia, perhaps because they have a lot of socialist, leftist, ideological, allegiances with Russia and China. Like you mentioned, the Uyghur issue as well. They're not willing to acknowledge the Uyghur internments. So I feel like Syrian people and general Muslims are caught in the middle where they have an imperialist on the east and an imperialist on the west, and they don't, on some issues they agree with one side and on others they agree with the other side. How does one maintain the moral consistency when dealing with these things? How do Syrians deal with it when they think
I,
about
I have
Palestine?
I have many Pakistani friends in the United States. Actually, two of our board members are Pakistani American physicians, and we believe the same that Palestinians, Syrians, Bosnians, Uyghur, Rohingya are victims of powers or of their regimes, and they need to be supported. In Syria, because of the close proximity of Palestine, it's part of our DNA to support Palestinians. From the time you are born to the time you are die, Palestine, Palestine, Palestine. We believe in the liberation of Palestine. Many of the families who are from Syria are Palestinians and vice versa. Same people, same culture, same food, same cuisine, same history. I have many Palestinian friends when I was growing in Homs, and the same thing in Chicago. I was the head of one of the largest Palestinian mosques. And I've been in Gaza, as I've mentioned 4 times. So to me, there's no contradiction of supporting the Palestinian rights and supporting the Syrian rights. But there is a contradiction if you think that um, Hezbollah is is by slaughtering Syrian children is doing service to itself or to the cause or to Islam. Actually, one of the um, reasons that Israel was able to infiltrate Hezbollah is the track of Hezbollah in Syria. Because when they used to go to areas in Aleppo or Madaya and they video themselves, they mocked the Syrian children who were victims of chemical weapons. And these videos and pictures were taken by the Israeli intelligence, and then they figure out who are these people, and then they track them and so forth. There's collected a lot of information about them when they were in Syria. So they targeted them in Syria and also in Lebanon. I think the main mistake that Hezbollah has done is intervening in Syria and slaughtering Syrian civilians on behalf of Iran's agenda and the Assad regime. And that was its Achilles um, wound that led to its compromise and
You,
these recent
you
attacks.
see that a lot of Iraqi militias, like you saw Muqtada al-Sadr passing a statement that the Syrian people need to decide. You do see a shift in the Shia militias of the region, whether they're in Iraq or in Lebanon, and attitudes are changing. Do you think there could be a potential for reconciliation with Hezbollah once the Assad regime is out?
I hope so. I mean, Hezbollah was very popular in Syria at one point before it intervened in Syria. And many Sunni Syrians supported Hezbollah um, um, and its leader. I mean, Syria has, as I mentioned, history of diversity and tolerance and um, neighborly relations between Shias and Sunni. And we have, of course, several Shia sects. We have the mainstream Shia, the Imamis, we have the Ismailis, we have the Alawite, and each one of them have their different uh, uh, rituals and so forth. But we live together, and you cannot differentiate between Sunni Syrian and Shia Syrian and Alawi Syrian. We look the same, we speak the same slang, we eat the same food, and I hope that at one point we have this reconciliation among us. There's no animosity between Syrians and Iraqis and Lebanese. I think all of this is created by political power or Iran to advance its agenda. And hopefully, by the ending of the Assad regime, things will go back to the way they were, which is basically neighborly relations and respect of you and respect of me without, you trying to kill me for to take revenge on what happened 1500 years ago and vice versa. That's not going to help us. I think if we focus on the future and development and building our countries and building healthcare and schools and roads would be better for us than talking about what happened 1500 years ago.
Right. You don't want young people being killed in the name of Hassan and Hussein and what
Fatima
have
and
you, and
Zainab and
Fatima and
Ruqayya.
Zainab and this and that and the other. I think we should focus on the here and now is developing Syria, infrastructure, having people live decent lives. Do you think HTS and Jolani, who are suspect at best, being honest, have very strange pasts with a lot of these characters? Do you think they're trustworthy as someone who is operating medical teams on ground? Do you think you instinctively trust these people to allow the diversity of Syria, to tolerate the minorities, and to not try to impose some hardline Islamic Sharia state and maybe not use Syria as a launching platform for the great caliphate against the West or the East or whatever. Do you think the attitudes have changed, or do you think these people are more of the same?
I think, well, several observations. First of all, this is a very important question. And I think people should ask it and should monitor the situation. And we should not be just listening to the rhetoric, which is in general are very positive in the last a few months, and especially in this last campaign. If you listen to what the leader of HTS has been saying, and including his recent interview with CNN, he's saying positive messages, sending positive messages to Syrians. He's talking about building institutions, diversity, um, uh, protection of the minorities, not interfering with neighboring countries, and so forth. I think this is all positive. He mentioned himself that he was evolved. He got evolved, or he was evolved as a person, as a movement, and that at one point he will dissolve HTS. We'll have to see that, but I think people are anxious because we've tried that in Syria, and we've seen it also in other places, and it's not good for the population when you try to impose extremist ideology that no matter how you color it, some people will feel that they are less citizen than others or less equal than others. I have Christian friends in Syria. We are classmates, and we have a group that we discuss, and they were very anxious of what's going on, and they said, okay, this is Islamic State 2.0. They're going to try to implement Sharia. That means we cannot live in Syria and so forth. So people are very anxious, but we have to see. And I think the Syrian people in general are very moderate. They're educated, they're diverse, as I mentioned, and they will not allow these kind of ideologies to take hold again, I hope.
Do you get skeptical as a Syrian who's seen the way the West picked up this issue and then dropped it very quickly? Do you see now CBS, with the documentary a couple of years ago, and now with the quick CNN interview with Jolani? Does that make you skeptical about the whole situation? Because the West tends to pick up issues and then drop them, maybe for the behest of Saudi Arabia or Israel or their Middle Eastern policy. Do you think that Syria will get picked up as a cynical sort of advantageous thing, used and then abused and then thrown away again and ignored? Because right now there is a lot of talk about Turkey being a NATO ally, considering that they're supporting part of the rebel forces. Do you see NATO's and the West's involvement here as something that you're going to go full fledged for, or do you think the Syrian people are more cynical and skeptical this time, and that they'll be more aware of the situation around them?
Um, I mean, that's good question, and I am quite involved in local politics in the United States, in my adopted country. So I speak regularly with my senators, with my congressmen. I speak with the State Department. I met with President Biden, with Vice President Harris. I met with President Obama, especially at the peak of the Syrian crisis, a couple of times. So I kind of know how they look at Syria and what's going on in the Middle East. And frankly, it's not one of my government's priorities. Syria is a small country in the Middle East that does not have oil. The way that American politicians look at Syria is through the prism of how would that affect Israel, and how would that affect the flow of oil, and how would that affect terrorism. So they don't look at it from what's good for Syrians, unfortunately. We tried to change that narrative by saying, okay, well, it's good for the United States to support the Syrian people because stability is good for the region, all of these things. But people don't know what you know about Syria and what you know about the region. And we try to educate our policymakers. Turkey, you've mentioned Turkey. I think Turkey is a major power that is behind many of the things that are happening in the last 9 days, and the reason behind it is because there is 3.5 million refugees in Turkey, and there is anti-refugee sentiment, and of course, Turkey look at Syria as a threat also because you have an autonomous region in northeast of Syria that has Kurdish Syrians, and that is not good for Turkey. So Turkey want to make sure that there is no state that is Kurdish because there's 20 million Turkish Kurds also. So that's not good for Turkey. And but also Turkey want to have this crisis ends soon. So that's why Turkey has been supportive of the opposition groups that overtook Assad, Aleppo and Hama. By the way, President Erdogan tried to reconcile with Assad. He asked him to meet with him multiple times and asked Russia to intervene for this for the past year or so. Assad, you know, being stubborn and an idiot, refused and so forth. And so I think what we're seeing right now is the result of the um, refusal of Assad to meet with Erdogan and reconcile with him. And I think the Arab League also gave Assad multiple chances to normalize. They invited him to the Arab League summit and the Islamic summit in Saudi Arabia, and they asked him a couple of things. They asked him to bring back refugees and stop the flow of Captagon to the region, and he did not do any of that. So I think people gave up in general, the regional powers and Turkey on Assad, and that's part of the dynamics that we're seeing right now.
We'll get back to the normalization process that was going on with Bashar and Bashar prior to the last 10 days, in the last couple of years, what was going on. But before that, you mentioned that you were active in American local politics in your adopted country of America. And you've been lobbying, and I mentioned that you mentioned only Democratic representatives. What do you think of the Trump regime, and what do you think is going to be their vision for Syria? Because Donald Trump is a big sort of PR sort of guy. He looks at what the PR is going to be with regards to Syria. So this happening right now, right before he takes up office, it's very advantageous on the part of Turkey, right? That and we'll get to the normalization stuff. But what do you think the Trump regime is going to make of all of this situation? Because they are going to inherit, 8, 10, 20 conflicts around the world. Um, One of them being Syria. Yeah. What do you think of the situation in Syria and with regards to Donald Trump? And have you done any lobbying with the Trump regime?
Yes, I think if you belong to an ethnic group and you care about your homeland, you have to work with all parties. So I'm a humanitarian. I'm not a politician. So in order to get the medicine to people in Syria or in Palestine or anywhere else, you have to work with the Democratic Party of the Republicans also. I have not met with President Trump, but we have a group of Syrian American who formed organization that met with him and supported him in the previous term and also in this term. I'm more supportive of the Democratic Party because the Democratic Party is more protective of human rights and minorities in the United States, and they believe more in social justice, which I believe in. So my values are aligned more with the Democratic Party in the United States, but when it comes to the Middle East, the Republicans and the Democrats are the same. There's minor differences. Trump, in general, is not a traditional politician. He's a businessman. He said that he want to stop the wars. So I think instability is not good for his image. But he also is anti-Iran more than the Democrats. So he doesn't like Iran. He's, of course, very supportive of UAE and Saudi Arabia, or they are very supportive of him. So, and he wants to have a deal that creates stability in the Middle East to improve economy and so forth. When it comes to Syria, I think he does not want to have war. He may get along with President Erdogan because both of them are strong men, and I believe that the Turkish government like President Trump more than President Biden. So maybe there is some intersection in their interest. He wants to withdraw the American troops from Syria. He tried to do that last term. And if that happened, then that's going to create a vacuum that will be filled by Turkey. So that has to be seen. How would that happen? Turkey right now, through its support to the opposition parties in Syria, control maybe 60% of Syria. But there's still the northeast that is supported by American troops. There's 2,000 or right now 800 American troops that supports SDF, which is the Kurdish Syrian party that they want to have an autonomous state. So if United States Trump withdrew the American troops from this area, then I think Turkey will fill that vacuum and control the whole region.
I think that was a very
It's
accurate situation.
complicated, but
Yeah, no,
I
no,
don't
no,
know if
no.
I made
You
sense.
know, like SDF is supported by the Americans, but they support Bashar, and the air support is Russian. It's a very mixed situation. It's very complicated. I don't think it's very simple. And you mentioned Trump, and you mentioned your politics. I mean, what your politics is your concern, but I think that the general stance is to lobby for the Syrian people in the United States, and Trump wouldn't like any sort of instability or war. It's off brand for him, and I think a normalization process is due. But you saw that Bashar was being normalized. Now, coming back to the earlier point, we saw that Bashar was being normalized up until about like a couple of months ago. And the Saudis had acknowledged him, the Emiratis had acknowledged him. You know, he was having a visit to China. They were talking about opening up to Western markets as well. Even in Iran, the new regime, the new government is about liberalization and opening Iran to the Western markets. Do you think that Iran is going to be able to sustain Bashar? And do you think Bashar was being normalized too early on? Maybe Saudi Arabia and the UAE made a miscalculation, and Turkey was more trepidatious and more careful with regards to Bashar.
Um, I think the normalization process was indirect outcome of Biden's administration ignoring Syria and basically telling the Arabs, Saudi Arabia and UAE, do whatever you want. If you want to normalize with Bashar al-Assad, normalize, but try to get something out of it. I mean, that was the message that we got from our government, from the American government, that they are against normalization of Assad, but they're not going to stop the regional power from doing so. But they asked these Arab countries, Egypt, Jordan, UAE, and Saudi Arabia, try to get something out of it. And these Arab countries wanted to get, as I've mentioned, three things. The first one is, can you get some of the refugees from Lebanon and Jordan back, and provide them with safe atmosphere? Don't put them in prisons. Can you stop the flow of Captagon? Captagon is a stimulant that is produced in Syria and exported in the tons, by tons, to Jordan, to the Gulf states, and it's easily abusive drug, and it brings billions of dollars to the Assad regime. And can you start a political process based on the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2254? I mean, these were the three requests to the Assad regime, and he did not do any of them. Um, uh, I think right now it's too late to float the Assad regime. I think the Assad regime is done, um, because of what's happening right now. And there's already now talk about that he's leaving to Russia, or who will replace him and so forth. I think we're not going to be able to reverse what happened. Assad, Iran, Russia are not able to save him at this point.
They
And
don't seem they don't seem as interested anymore, because I think that he was a husk of a regime. He was being propped up anyways earlier on. I don't think there was any real steam. You even see that the Alawite communities have started to work with HTS, because they see that this is the inevitable future, and HTS has given everyone guarantees that, you know, minorities will be respected. And there was only a small minority that was benefiting, I think, from Bashar, and they've lost that support base now as well. You saw this, the general Shia militias have been slow to mobilize and have given statements like Muqtada al-Sadr statement. And I think the original founder of Hezbollah has also given a statement recently, very recently, which is a sort of a vague sort of,
Tufaili,
yeah,
Tufaili,
it's
yeah.
a vague sort of, you know, maybe we shouldn't, you know, mess around with this anymore, because I think that For the greater Palestinian cause, for the Lebanese cause, for the Syrian cause, it's better to reconcile than to try to keep propping up Bashar. You know, and it's very embarrassing, like you mentioned, to see reasonable people like Aaron Mate and other journalists in this delusion of defending Russia or whatever. They're trying to prop up Bashar, whereas they can criticize Bashar and still be anti-imperialist or whatever. They don't have to defend Bashar. A lot of the dictators in the region, a lot of the regimes in the region are afraid of what happened to Muammar al-Gaddafi and to Saddam Hussein. And when they see that, they make their grip tighter on the people. Do you think there is a potential for some sort of reconciliation where they are allowed to leave, or do you think this is going to be brutal and violent at the end?
I hope that it will not be as brutal. I mean, it's already, I mean, the civil war in Syria killed 600,000 people and displaced half of the population. I don't know what else it can happen. But still, I mean, if Shia militias intervened from Iraq, al-Hashd, for example, gonna be as another war between the Sunnis and Shia that will slaughter hundreds of thousands of people. I can tell you that because it was tried before, it was brutal, and I think right now HTS has different level of power than they had before, and the opposition troops. So they're not gonna take it
I
the same
also
way
think
they
Hashd
took us.
Shabi and Hezbollah and all these organizations have run dry. They are fatigued
Yes,
right
yes,
now from
yeah.
combat and
The best thing that can
yeah.
happen, Akhi, is if President Assad left to Russia or Iran or to any place of his choosing, UAE, and gave the power to a transitional government, and then that transitional government incorporated some of the opposition party and organized an election after a couple of years.
And then
I think,
HTS could be disbanded and people could right.
yeah,
So the Taliban had. So we were here discussing and we were watching the news and we saw that it is a very similar style return or rebellion like the Taliban in Afghanistan this time. They spread very quickly. They did not try to manage the local municipal systems. They've made very clear that this is a national, revolutionary nationalism. They don't want any caliphate or any outside. We are all about Afghanistan. Minorities will be secured, and so on and so forth. The Taliban had a general pardon for everyone in Afghanistan. Anyone who was involved with the American alliance, they were all pardoned. They reprimanded the troops if they killed or detained anyone. Do you think this similar kind of attitude is being inspired in the Syrian rebellion right now, where they just want Bashar out? They don't want to do anything else. They're just like, you have to go, and we have to form a new Syria.
yeah, but I don't think that parallel with analogy to Taliban is right. I mean, there might be some
Similarities.
similarities in terms of, but HTS is not Taliban. I've been in Idlib multiple times. We have clinics and so forth, and I've witnessed the evolution of Idlib. Idlib was under the control of HTS since it was liberated, and it's been very pragmatic evolution to very moderate
No, so
place.
those. So let me clarify. I'm not talking about in terms of ideology. The cultural differences between the Afghan Taliban and the Syrian people. Syria is very educated. People are very diverse and modern. Afghanistan is a different tribal society. I'm talking about in terms of the politics. In terms of the politics of everyone is forgiven. We're going to form a new transition government. We have to stabilize Afghanistan. This is about Afghanistan. I'm saying in that terms, they're not similar in the sense of the culture, and not at all. I
Yes,
mean,
if that's
yeah, yeah,
what you're, yes, of course. I mean, I think if that's a model that can be taken from Afghanistan, it looks like the same thing is happening right now. So HTS has given assurances to the Ismailis, to the Christians in Aleppo, to the Alawite, to the people who are defecting from the army that we're not going to do anything to you as long as you don't fight us. And we're going to keep the same institutions and administrations in Aleppo and major cities. We're not going to interfere with this. In a few instances where there were some violations, people were disciplined and
like
so
the
forth.
Christmas tree, and they had put
Yeah,
it back. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and they showed actually that they cared about Christians. They put Christmas trees themselves and so forth. So I think it's maybe similar to what Taliban. I mean, I don't know the details of what
Right. Sure.
Taliban
Bad
Pakistan has done.
analogy, I guess. I
Yeah.
think the devil is in the details. But what do you think of the cynicism that this is, that Jolani and all of these guys, this is all lip service? And because, the Western media, considering that they're covering this in positive light, it it triggers a kind of cynicism in people where they're like,
Hmm.
then this has to be, Al Qaeda
A
2.0
plot.
or yeah, plot. Whereas there is also a reverse cynicism that the reason they're doubling down on this is to, sow chaos. If you play, so the 3D chess mind will say that, aha, these are Al Qaeda again and ISIS again. But if you're playing 4D chess, you would say, no, they're doubling down because this is something decent and they want chaos to be sown. Do you understand? Do you follow what I'm saying?
So, I'm 59 years old. So I reached to the conclusion, brother, that there are not many conspiracy theories. So I'm anti-conspiracy theory. So I believe that the United States does not know everything and they don't control everything. And
So they're not
their
they
policy is
right. So part of their conspiracy mind would be to ascribe omnipotence to them. Part of it is that
yes.
and omniscience.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, they know everything and they control what Al Jawlani did and so forth. They created ISIS and they plot with Iran and they plot with Israel and they plot with Hezbollah. I mean, the conspiracy mind is very complicated minds. I have many arguments with friends who believe in conspiracy theories, and I don't get anywhere. So I believe in what I see. I believe. I mean, I have access to the American government and their thinking or lack of thinking about what's going on in Syria. They actually don't know what's happening in Syria. Many times when I used to go into medical missions to Syria and I go back and meet with the National Security Council or State Department or my senators, the information that I bring to them, it's the first time that they hear this information. I mean, I can tell you this for sure. I have stories and written articles about this. So they don't know. I mean, CNN interviewing Al Jolani has nothing to do with the American policy or politics. It's basically because they want to have high rating, and I think it's interesting person to interview. Um, and I think many people in the State Department, this is the first time they encounter Julani when they listen to his interview with CNN. Whether that will help them framing policy, or they will leave it to the next administration, or they will try to shape the direction of what's happening in Syria, that has to be seen. One of the things, and this is not conspiracy, there is a base of the United States in Al Tanaf in Syria. It's at the border of Iraq and Jordan. So the purpose of that base, American base, a military base, is to prevent Shia militia coming from Iraq or Iran to Syria. And also, it controls this kind of strategic area between Iraq, Jordan, and Syria. And also, the purpose of that, according to the American policy, is to fight ISIS. Okay, now you have Syrian troops that were trained by the American base in an area called Al-Rukban near Al-Tanaf. And now they are trying to also move to fight with the opposition troops that are coming from the north, and they want to control this area in southeast Syria and central Syria. So you can say, well, the American now try to have assert more control by triggering these troops called Al-Jaysh al-Watani or Al-Jaysh al-Watani. So that way, it's not only HTS that the Americans have no control on, but also now you have Syrians supported by American troops that also trying to control parts of Syria. So this is, I can say that maybe the American government is trying to now insert itself in this, so it doesn't end up only Turkey controlling what's going on in Syria, but also part of the Syrian opposition troops that are supported by America, besides the SDF in the
But what's
northeast.
the point of understanding all these distinctions when they're all Takfiri Wahhabis? Why do you?
They're not. They're not takfiri. I mean, all of them are like me and
No,
you.
normal Muslim. Yeah, exactly. This is the
Yeah.
we had the exact same discussion in Urdu. I think it's going to be released this time soon, and we were talking about this and how it was used in Pakistan as well to justify our involvement in the Afghan war with the Americans. Oh, they're this, they're Khawarij, they're that, they're the other. They have beards and they smell bad, and they eat. They live with sheep and blah blah blah. It's the same kind of dehumanizing language that you see in Western Islamophobia. It's just simply being adopted by people who are anti-imperialistic, and I think it's very ironic. Like you said, a lot of these conspiracy-minded people and people who want to paint with a broad brush stroke all of the population of Syria and the surrounding regions will use the same rhetoric that Israel will use. Yani when they say, "Oh, these people are Nazis and these people are Amalek and they're human animals," it's a very similar thing to say, "Oh, these people are Takfiri Wahhabis and therefore we can slaughter them." In conclusion, I've taken up a lot of your time and you've been very patient with us. Thank you. What is your hope and what do you think is going to happen? Because people demand a prediction from people like you with all your experience. You hope one thing, but what do you think is going to happen in the next foreseeable few weeks and months?
If we believe what's happening in front of our eyes and the signs that are happening, Russia and Iran telling Assad, we're not going to be able to support you this time. The acceleration, the speed of events that are happening right now, 75% of Syria under control of different opposition groups suddenly, including major cities that were never under the control of the opposition groups, HTS and Jaish al-Watan al-Hur and Jaish, all of these groups. Um, the Assad regime, it looks like it will fall within the next few days. And I hope that this would be the best end of a very brutal regime that caused a lot of mayhem and suffering in Syria and in the region. I hope that the next dynamics in Syria will be different than what we've seen in Libya, for example, or Yemen, or other places where or in Iraq, where you have a dictator that has been in power for a long time and then suddenly is removed, and then you will have chaos
In the
and
vacuum, right?
and vacuum and extremism and slaughtering and so forth. I hope that we will
I
not
think
go
that
through this.
experience with ISIS and the problem of the Shia militias has been done. I think this time, inshallah, we have a lot of hope for Syria.
Inshallah.
And we pray for
Inshallah.
Syria and we all want to visit you in Syria, inshallah.
Syria has the best cuisine, by the way,
Without a
in the
doubt,
Middle East.
without a doubt,
Yeah, in
the
the Middle
Levant
East.
is the best cuisine.
Yeah.
In fact,
I visited
yeah.
Pakistan and I enjoyed the Pakistani food, but Syrian cuisine
No,
is.
no, no, no. We honor you. We honor you. We honor you. It's the greatest cuisine and one of the finest cuisines in the world, inshallah. And we hope to have it in Homs and in Damascus and in the Halab
Inshallah.
and to see these historic places. These are 10, 20,000 year old places. This is where human civilization comes from. This is a great deep history, and we would be honored to come see you guys, inshallah, in Syria. How can people connect with you and Med Global? And if they'd like to volunteer, help, add, in any way, what can they do? How can they reach out?
Our organization in the business of saving lives. If you believe that the lives of people who are oppressed and persecuted and victims of wars and the refugees and the displaced worth supporting, you can support our medical programs, donating at medglobal.org. And
Put
there's
put
a
the
list
website
of the
here.
countries that we support and how your donations, zakat money is accepted, sadaqah is accepted. You can volunteer if you're a physician or a nurse or midwife in some of our medical missions, and we have a page about how to volunteer and so forth. And also keep us in your dua, not only the people of Syria, but the people and the victims of wars and disaster everywhere. And inshallah, we can meet always in good times.
Inshallah. Dr. Zahir, thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome. Thank you.